What I'd like to do now, though, is, I think we all had, and we're centering and circling around that common definition. What can that look like within daily instruction, specifically if we use Nearpod as a best practice tool in order to do that? And the way I want to do that, I think Courtney mentioned that both Michael and I are passionate about SEL. And I'm going to weave in just a few bits and pieces of my personal story of being a former math teacher and what SEL has meant to me. And the first thing I ask, and I want you to ponder for a moment, is how do these two things relate? Fraction circles and chicken soup for the teenage soul. I hope I at least spark some attention, especially when we're in this webinar format of going, I wonder where she's going with this, right? How could these two things relate? Well, what it really centered around was the fact that I was teaching 6th grade mathematics, and I had students who, at the time, it was my second year of teaching, I would say I felt like I was really failing at classroom management in trying to interact with my students. I was really trying to focus on how can I help them get excited and want to learn about fractions, which is a tricky topic for many students. And I was centering around how could I improve about being more organized or orderly or focused. And, frankly, classroom management is the #1 thing a principal may give as that constructive feedback, because it's often the hallmark of an inexperienced or less effective teacher. And, I did a lot of research. I was a self-starter, self-motivated myself. But I really came upon something as I started to get to know my students better in terms of that relationship building, and said, I'm going to continue to struggle in this job if I don't put my students in a learning mindset first. I can put them in rows, I can try to make things orderly, I can put great systems in place, but if their head isn't in the game, I'm in a lot of trouble. So what I did is, at the beginning of every single math lesson, I read Chicken Soup for the Teenage Soul. And those 5 minutes that I spent interacting with students, creating relationships, looking at perspectives, and really making those deposits in those students, I was able to make that withdrawal in terms of really getting at complex, conceptual development of mathematics, because I had built that relationship. Now, one thing Michael and I were talking, before this webinar, and the truth is, SEL has been around a long time. We just didn't define it. Either it was an individual like me really trying to find a way to really address the whole child, but I had to work hard. This was back in the day when I could go to Borders or Barnes and Nobles and I searched for what could help me, right? Because it was like a day-to-day struggle. Now, how can we use the frameworks that have really entered into the dialogue, like the Castle framework, in order to have a more predictable system or an intentionality around being able to integrate SEL into the classroom, so that I don't have to, I would rely on my school counselor to help me with that. Now it's, what can I do as a teacher to make sure I'm addressing that whole child? So again, we mentioned already, I'm a former math teacher. So you might also be thinking, okay, how can I get that intentional? Because frankly, Chicken Soup for the Teenage Soul was a way to make connections, but it wasn't intentional to how I could apply SEL into a subject area. So let's take a look at how that could work within a classroom setting with authentic application and modeling of social and emotional learning for students. So let's think about that Collaborate board. I already mentioned before that the Collaborate board, especially with the anonymity, is a great way to reduce anxiety for a student to want to participate in learning. But I want to think about another one of the CASEL core competencies, SEL core competencies, that could be at play with this. So let's say I'm going into a lesson, and we don't actually have to actively participate in this interactivity unless you want to. My math folks out there, you might be really energized to do it. I might go into a classroom and I would ask the question to assess prior knowledge. What do you already know about quadratic relationships? This is where I call my Pop-Tarts and my crock pots. When I ask a question and I assess for prior knowledge, typically what happens, 2 to 3 kids raise their hand. Those are my Pop-Tarts. They go up quickly. They often take the lion's share of breath and space in the classroom around that verbal participation. But what really exists in many classrooms are crockpots. Many children who need to actually simmer before they can respond, or who need models in order to be able to produce and be contributors to that classroom environment. So here's something I want you to consider. By a feature like Collaborate, not only does it integrate the social aspect, it is actually teaching the skill of self-management for some students, impulse control. For my pop charts in the classroom, am I taking the lion's share and breath of the room? Or am I allowing for my classmates also to be active participants in that classroom and allowing them to simmer? So I think this is an interesting way to think about how can I more naturally integrate this on a daily basis, but really teach that skill to students who maybe have that impulse control of active participation. Now, a hallmark feature within Nearpod is being able to bring the world into the classroom through our VR field trips. We have over 350,000. Well, let's think about quadratic relationships and perhaps think about how can I use a setting such as this, maybe a basketball court, and start to really assess prior knowledge this way, where I'm not just asking and expecting students to share via that Collaborate board, providing new perspectives or new ways that students can tap into the examples or that learning. Or I could seamlessly integrate not only the engaging VR, still a little abstract, I could follow this up with an example of math and basketball where I start to watch a video and start to look at how quadratic relationships or how a quadratic function or pattern is actually going to be at play here. Because here's what I want you to consider. Teachers can model social awareness by integrating examples to which students can relate. So when confronted with examples that are relevant to their peers, students are given opportunities to respect the interests and appreciate the diversity that might be in the school environment. And thinking about how can I take my gifts, maybe, and I was this student, I was a Pop-Tart in the math classroom, I have to admit it. And what I know about quadratic relationships, but what about my classmate sitting next to me where this maybe was a struggle? How can I tap into the interest? I did not have an interest in basketball, but how could we then merge our interests together in order to advance learning as a class? Another thing you can think about is through Nearpod, we can integrate some of the best in class third-party digital offerings out there, including Desmos. So thinking about how you could structure the classroom and have students not only work independently, but maybe work in small group instruction in order to work with this interactive feature right within Nearpod. Because technology, I want you to think about this, should include heads out of device moments. We should use this to develop relationship skills through teamwork, where we really push that small group instruction, where students are collaborating, where we're activating those critical thinking skills. And we can use technology as a way to facilitate that. And what you'll notice is that these are components of a traditional lesson, but I'm more explicitly, intentionally thinking as a teacher, how am I putting that castle framework to work and having students authentically work those skills to address the whole child? Because for me, what I started to learn as I matured in my career is that classroom management is actually beyond creating order in the classroom. I think there are synonyms, whether it's social and emotional learning, whole child, student engagement, culturally responsive teaching. That's really where you can create that management in the classroom when you work those skills in an in-depth way. Now, the reality is that we also know that the students that we interface with in our classrooms or in our school and districts where we service may not come to the table with a clear understanding and never have been taught skills as they relate to SEL. So whether it's growth mindset practices, whether it is around goal setting, whether it is around building self-confidence, They may need those moments with explicit instruction. What I'd like to show is just a snippet of a way that you could integrate in a very quick way and an intentional way opportunities to work those skills explicitly as you do that in tandem through authentic application. We have over 175 lessons in Nearpod social and emotional learning curriculum, as well as a variety of video options from vocabulary that really build into developing and really explicitly teaching those skills. So an example could be the integration of the growth mindset into the classroom. So anybody who's taught mathematics, or I want you to think about an area that, or the subject area you teach in the really hard topic, right? And you have those moments where those crock pots who are simmering might be thinking, I can't do this. I'm not a math person, right? And we need to build up that confidence, and we need to explicitly teach that skill. Nearpod is really going to take away that need that I had to browse the bookstore aisles and really scrape and try to find a way to connect with my students, where we can naturally integrate with a quick 15-minute lesson, let's say around self-awareness, where I can use a polling feature where I can ask students, what's closest to your mood and energy level right now? So I can get a sense. We all feel that, you know, when you can cut the atmosphere with a knife, right? Where it's really heavy, especially when someone's trying to tackle something that requires perseverance, you can do a gut check around that. You can start teaching about what does growth mindset mean? This is an example where we define it. And then we can provide opportunities to practice, where we can model how we can change how we talk about what we're doing. For instance, I can't shoot a free throw, sorry, that's almost hard to say quickly 5 times, I challenge you on your own, or I can practice for 15 minutes every day until I improve my skills. And thinking about quadratic relationships is, you know, I'm not good at math, and maybe it's, you know, I can look at an example like basketball to better understand quadratic relationships. And how can I shift just my mindset when I tackle something new? We can use things like the collaborate board to start talking about, how did it make you feel when you turned that I can't statement into I can? And provide additional ways for students to really think about how they can change their mindset as they tackle something more challenging, such as, I'm not good at this. If I keep practicing, I can improve. Mistakes mean I'm a failure, into mistakes help me learn. You know, I wish I was the best, into it's inspiring to see other people's success, and so forth. We model through our lessons as well, not only the interactivity that one sees within Nearpod, but how can I have great heads out of device moments for those classroom discussions? And then ways for me to be able to produce, right, and show and demonstrate my understanding of how what I've been sharing verbally, how can I do that in a concrete way so that I have evidence as a teacher that I'm really making headway. For instance, I'm having students move those I can't, that fixed mindset, into the I cans of the growth mindset. Thinking about, when I leave this, how can I do and how can I integrate growth mindset into my daily practice to achieve goals? Now, when we looked at what was really important, what came out of the report and recommendations for district leaders in the state of Utah, it's about not only having a curriculum or a way in order to engage students around SEL, it's how can I extend that beyond the classroom setting? When I think about Nearpod can be taught both in teacher-paced lesson, which you're experiencing now, or in student-paced. And what teachers can do is they can make available that content through a student-paced lesson that can also be delivered through Canvas, so that parents can also start to really talk about with their child, you know, what does it mean in order to set goals, to really move from that fixed to growth mindset, so that we can, as a broader community, really work those SEL students with not only our students, but with our children. And the other thing is that while SEL may be familiar, just like with students, there are times where as educators ourselves, I know I've really benefited from having really concrete professional development and growth around, what is social emotional learning, and how does that relate to the practice as an educator, and how can I be more effective with students? Nearpod does have pre-made lessons that are aimed more of a teacher as a student, where I can use Nearpod's interactive software to dive into topics such as SEL, with content that was developed with best-in-class partners like the New Teacher Center. Now, a lot of what I provided in terms of an overview is available in a simple document that you can download and really consider post this webinar. And as Michael mentioned in Nearpod, you can feel free to download this right now, or post meeting, Courtney will be sending out an email so that you can have access to the great content that we're sharing today.